Okay. All right, so we're going to start on chapter 16 today. It's like half of you are here, so awesome. Chapter 16 is on plants and fungi, and so today is going to be about land plants. We're going to talk about how aquatic organisms transition to being terrestrial organisms. So chapter 15, we ended up last class talking about seaweeds, talking about algae. So we looked at, looked at protists in general, but we ended up with talking about the algae. So those were aquatic plants, so aquatic photosynthetic organisms. And I talked a little bit about brown algae, which had some characteristics that we'll see today in the land plants, but not all of them. It did have kind of differentiated tissue. They had the holdfast and the blade and the stipe, and it was able to transport some nutrients along the stipe, but not nearly the way that land plants do. So we'll talk about some of the adaptations that plants have had to develop in order to survive being on land. And that's really kind of the big picture of today. Okay. So, all right, so green algae, so green algal protists. So these green algae are the ancestors, the closest relatives of land plants. Red and green algae are both in the kingdom Plantae. Land plants, which are what most of you think of when you hear the word plant, or even when you hear the word photosynthesizing, you think of trees and think of land plants. They are a branch off of the green algal tree, and I'll show you that in a minute here. In order for plants to be able to survive being on land, they needed to develop a bunch of different strategies, mostly to avoid desiccation, to avoid drying out. That was kind of the biggest risk. So an aquatic plant has no problem with water. It's surrounded in water. So it does not need to survive periods of drought. A land plant does. So a land plant has something called a cuticle. So it's kind of in the middle of that right side. A cuticle is an outer coating, an outside of them, that is going to reduce water loss. And you probably noticed as most plants have kind of a waxy feel to the outside of them. That's part of the cuticle, the outside layer. And they have specific locations for gas exchange called stomata, or stoma. And we looked at that a little bit when we were back in the photosynthesis chapter. We talked about CO2 and O2 exchanging through openings. So whereas seaweed, an aquatic plant, can exchange gas through every cell because it doesn't have to worry about losing water. A land plant has to confine those water loss zones to specific areas on the plant. It also has to deal with gravity. So aquatic plants can hold themselves up pretty easily in the water, whereas a land plant has to stand upright against gravity. So they need a shoot that is able to support the plant and keep them upright. They need an adaptation for how to get water, so they need roots that will anchor the plant and will help them absorb water and materials from the soil. They also need specialized reproductive cells, reproductive structures to protect their offspring, and we'll talk about the development of those over time. And they'll have specialized regions for photosynthesis. So they have very specialized regions. They have some cells that are developed specifically for anchoring and getting water, roots. They have cells that are specifically used to support the plant, the shoot. They have cells that are specifically for photosynthesizing, the leaves. And they have cells that are specific for reproduction. Whereas an aquatic plant, every cell kind of does every one of those roles. There's not as much specialization. There's not as much need for specialization. Okay. So tissue differentiation is what this is called. And tissue differentiation, it was important for land plants to develop so that they would have access to all the nutrients they need, including light, carbon dioxide, and water. Aquatic plant, again, could get all three of those in one location, so each cell could do all the roles. A land plant doesn't. It gets water from the ground, it gets carbon dioxide from the air, and it gets light from the sun, from above it. So it needs to have these different roles of different cells to be able to get all of those things at once. Okay. So, if we look a little closer inside the plant, we'll see that they have specialized cells, specialized structures on the inside as well as the outside. So some plants, and we'll talk about which ones do and which ones don't in a few minutes, some plants have something called vascular tissue. And vascular tissue is a system of tube-shaped cells to transport nutrients and water. And the two kinds of vascular tissue that are found in plants are xylem, which transport water, and phloem, that transport sugar. So I always remembered this by zip up the xylem. That was, you're taking water up from the ground with the xylem and flow around the phloem. Phloem is how sugars get transported down and up in whatever direction they need to go. So sugars that were made in the leaves can actually be transported down to the roots by the phloem. And water that's brought in from the soil can be brought up to the leaves by the xylem. So this again is something that an aquatic plant does not need because they are covered in water. So they can get water into any cell just by pulling it in from their environment. And since all cells are photosynthetic in most aquatic plants, they don't need to transport around the sugars. The exception of this was those brown algae that I talked about that could be 130 feet tall. Sometimes their bottom cells are not in the light. So you may have noticed I said that those types of seaweeds actually do have transport vesicles. We call that pseudovascular system because it's not really a vascular system like we see in plants, but it's similar. So we have a vascular system. So we have our blood vesicles, we have our lungs. We're able to transport things through that. That would be our vascular tissue system. It's the same idea in plants. So xylem and phloem allow them to transport tissues within the plant. Okay? So we'll talk about groups of plants that have these. We'll actually talk about some that don't have these as well and how they're different. And then another big thing that has allowed plants to colonize land are adaptations in reproductive tissue. So again, desiccation or drying is a major danger for plants, but it's also a major danger for plant embryos. So plant embryos have to be protected to keep them from drying out as they're developing. And so we're going to see something happen differently in land plants where they will have their embryos protected with gametangia in certain groups of plants. So that's when we see flowers. So flowers are not only a way to enhance reproductive success of the plant, but also a way to protect the embryos once they have developed within maternal tissue. All right, so we're going to talk about the different groups of plants and the different versions of these they have. And basically, we're going to be following them in order from most similar to aquatic plants to least similar to aquatic plants as we go through. So just to remind you where land plants fall, here's the eukaryotic tree. And last class, on Tuesday, we talked about pretty much everything else on here, all the things in yellow. All we have left to talk about are land plants, fungi, and animals. Land plants and fungi are this chapter. The chapter after the next test will be animals. So right here, the highlighted region is the land plants. You can see it's sister to the Charophyceae, and that's sister to the chlorophytes. So chlorophytes and Charophyceae, both of those are green algal lineages. And you'll notice that land plants is actually more closely related to the Charophyceae than both of them are to the chlorophyceae. So land plants are really just a branch off the green algal tree. They're very similar to green algae. And I'm going to show you what a charophyte looks like, that most closely related thing to land plants. And it actually has a lot of features that are similar to land plants. And we think that the first land plant was actually similar to a charophyte. So here's what a charophyte looks like. So charophytes are a modern-day lineage of green algae and may resemble one of the early plant ancestors. This is something you can actually find in the ponds around campus, something called chara. And charas actually have what kind of looks like pseudovascular tissue. They have these stems, they have these nodes around it, and they're a lot more solid than some of the other land plants. They have some reproductive tissue that's a little bit different, and they actually have a lot of similar things. So we think plants and present-day charophytes evolved from a common ancestor, and that common ancestor probably looked more like this than it does to a moss or a fern or something like that. So charophytes are the most closely related thing to land plants. Okay. All right. So there are 4 major groups of land plants, and we're going to go through each of them and talk about what makes them different and actually what has kind of been developed on each of these branches. Because they give us kind of a clue to what early land plants might have looked like. Now, they're modern-day land plants, even the bryophytes, are very different than ancient land plants would have been, or early land plants would have been, but they probably had similar characteristics, and we can learn something a little bit about how evolution drove plants towards land from those early charophytes. So we're going to look at bryophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, and really what I'm going to expect you to know from this chapter is just what new features are developed in each of these groups and what ancestral features they still have. So, and I kind of highlight that as we go through. I'll talk about the new feature and the ancestral features. So the new features that we'll see in each of these groups, the bryophytes, we'll see some early terrestrial adaptations found on them, and we'll learn about how bryophytes, which are our mosses, can survive on land. But we'll also learn about some of the limitations of the bryophyte. In the ferns, we'll see the first vascular tissue. So the origin of vascular tissue was where the bryophytes and the ferns diverged, and ferns actually have vascular tissue. We split off to the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms will see the origin of seeds. So ferns and bryophytes don't have seeds. Gymnosperms and angiosperms both have seeds. So we'll see what a seed does for the plant and how that has allowed gymnosperms and angiosperms to live in drier climates and to live further away from water than we'll see bryophytes and ferns. And then with angiosperms, we'll see what the flower has done. So we'll see the first occurrence of a flower, and we'll see seeds that actually have a casing around them. So gymnosperms are called naked seeded plants, and then we have the flowering plants in the angiosperms. Okay. So again, kind of the key things, and we'll go into a little more detail as we go through this, for each of these groups is that bryophytes are non-vascular plants, but they are found on land. So we'll see they're the first group, the simplest kind of land plant, but they are non-vascular. They don't have that xylem and phloem. We're going to see ferns, which are vascular plants, so they have xylem and phloem, but they don't have seeds. Then we're going to see gymnosperms, so these are our conifers for the most part. They have seeds, but those seeds are what are called naked seeds. They don't have fruits like we'll see in the angiosperms. And then we have angiosperms, which are our flowering plants, which are probably the ones that you are most familiar with, flowering plants. There's a lot of flowering plants down here. So these are the 4 groups that I'll be highlighting, and we'll be talking about the features of each of these 4 as we go through. Okay. All right, so the first group are the bryophytes. And you'll see they diverged fairly early, pretty much right after land plants came to be, about 475 million years ago. About 425 million years ago, bryophytes split off from the rest of land plants. So they are pretty early divergent plants, so they probably retain a lot of those ancestral features. So early land plants probably looked a lot like the bryophytes. And what a bryophyte is, it's a moss or a liverwort, and you probably know what a moss is. You probably don't know what a liverwort is, but they look a lot like mosses. So moss is a bryophyte. So some ways that mosses are adapted to life on land, they have a waxy surface. So green algae are pretty non-waxy leaves. If you rub them around, they don't feel very waxy to them. But mosses, if you feel the leaves of a moss, you'll feel it's fairly waxy. And what that does is it keeps the moss from drying out terribly, and it retains the water that's inside and prevents desiccation. They also have a protected embryo, so they have some features that allow them to protect their embryo. In green algae, all they do is they release their gametes, and the gametes come together and form an embryo, and it's just completely exposed. Doesn't really need to be protected because it's surrounded by water. Here, you'll have a protected embryo that does give it some kind of an extra chance, and we'll see how that happens. They still do retain some ancestral features. So these are features of aquatic plants. So ancestral features means features that are like your ancestors' features. In the case of mosses and liverworts, they require water to reproduce, and I'm going to show you why that is. So mosses and liverworts can never be very far away from water, and this is probably why you always find mosses in very humid environments, humid, damp environments near streams. They're on the shady side of the tree, not on the sun side. They don't like to dry out. We see, mosses all the time in the swamp area. You'll see moss growing, and it requires water. They also don't have vascular tissue, so they don't have xylem and phloem, which we'll see come about in the ferns. Okay, so the part of the moss that you're probably most familiar with, if you've looked at mosses, is the green part of it. The green part is the gametophyte. And if you remember us talking about this the other day, gametophytes are haploid. So they're like what our sperm or egg in humans would be, but multicellular. So gametophyte, the green part of the moss, is actually haploid. It only has half the number of chromosomes as the sporophyte. So mosses, just like all land plants, show an alternation of generation. They have a haploid gametophyte altering with a diploid sporophyte. So what happens, the gametophyte, the green part of the moss, when it's ready to reproduce, it releases gametes. It undergoes mitosis. It doesn't have to go through meiosis to produce a gamete because it's already haploid. So it just produces a gamete, a sperm, and an egg through meiosis. All right. The sperm and egg will fertilize each other and form a zygote, and the zygote will grow into the sporophyte. And the way that a moss protects its embryo, the zygote there, is that the egg actually stays within the female moss, and the sperm will swim using the water that surrounds the moss to the female moss and fertilize the egg. So if you've ever seen moss with this little stalk off the top of it, which if you're familiar with moss at all, you might have occasionally seen some like this, and take a look the next time you're near moss. This little stalk is actually the sporophyte. It grows out of the top of the gametophyte. So basically growing off of the head of the gametophyte is the sporophyte. And that is 2N. The sporophyte does not photosynthesize. It's not green. It doesn't have chlorophyll. And basically its job is a reproductive tissue. It's going to grow and divide, and then it's going to undergo meiosis in order to release spores, which will be haploid. So the sporophyte, which is diploid here, will undergo meiosis, will release spores, and those spores will become the next gametophyte. So the green part of the moss is haploid. The female egg stays inside of the female moss. They have a male version of the moss which releases sperm. The sperm fertilizes the egg. It then undergoes division to form this stalk, this sporophyte stalk. And then in the top of the stalk, meiosis occurs to form haploid spores. Those spores are spread out, and they will grow into green moss again, another gametophyte. So in this case, the dominant form of a moss is the gametophyte, and the smaller form, so the minor form, is the sporophyte. So the gametophyte is large, and the sporophyte is a small little stalk on top of it. So let me write this down so we remember it when we get to the ferns. So the dominant, so and then goes big. So it's got a little sporophyte and a big gametophyte. And we're going to see how this changes as we go to the other ones. Okay, so does this make sense so far, what I'm talking about? You know what a gametophyte is and a sporophyte, at least generally? People have questions on that? So do you know what haploid and diploid mean? Yes? No? It's okay if it's no. Oh, I just said little and big. So I have gametophyte is big, and the sporophyte here is little. So it's small. I could say small. Maybe that'll be better rather than little. So you have a big gametophyte and a small sporophyte. So what that means is that the gametophyte is haploid, only has one copy of each chromosome. The sporophyte is diploid, has two copies of each chromosome. And in this case, the gametophyte is larger than the sporophyte. In the case of humans, a human, is it haploid or diploid? Do we have two copies of each chromosome or only one? Yeah, we have two. We get one from our father, one from our mother. So together they're two. So would we be a gametophyte or a sporophyte? Yeah, we'd be a sporophyte, really. We'd be a sporophyte. We produce gametes. Those are sperm and egg, and those are haploid. But we don't actually have a gametophyte generation because we don't have a multicellular generation as a haploid. But we would be a sporophyte because we're 2N. We're diploid. So we're kind of the opposite of what a fern is. Fern is big as a gametophyte and small as a sporophyte. We are big as a sporophyte, and we really don't have a gametophyte anymore. All right. Okay, so we're going to see how this changes, and that's the important part, is watching how this changes in the different types of plants. Okay, so here, bryophytes or mosses were our first group. They have a dominant gametophyte generation and a reduced sporophyte. Right, the second group are the ferns. And if you remember from this chart, ferns, we're going to look for the origins of vascular tissue. So the big advancement that ferns have over mosses is that they have vascular tissue. So vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. It allows for transport of water and nutrients. So they can bring water up from their bases, and they can let sugars flow around in the phloem. What this does is it allows them to grow to a much greater height. So if you're out in the woods and you compare the size of the mosses versus the size of the ferns, which one's bigger? So, you know how big a moss often is? About that big, maybe? And you can get ferns that are pretty big. We have a lot of ferns down here. Ferns are pretty large. Right? So ferns can be much bigger, so greater height, and also greater resistance to desiccation. Desiccation is drying out. So because they have vascular tissue, their leaves can dry out a bit and they'll still be okay because they can pull water up from their roots. Right? Moss doesn't have that advantage. If a moss dries out, it's not going to survive very well, whereas a fern can dry out. And we have things like resurrection fern here that will dry out nearly completely, and then you water them and they come back to life pretty easily, quickly. They're able to survive that great period of drought. Right? So ferns have vascular tissue, so they're able to survive in a slightly drier climate, or at least a climate that is dry for periods of the year. So ferns will actually live in more habitats than you'll see mosses, but they still require water for reproduction. So whereas mosses needed water for reproduction and water to survive, ferns can survive being drier, but they still require water for reproduction. So at least part of the year, they have to be in a very wet environment in order to survive. So this is why ferns do really well here, where we have a period of intense rain during the summer, and then we have a period of drought during the winter. Ferns can survive that drought pretty easily because they have the summer months where they can reproduce, and they can soak up a lot of water during the summer. So it's maybe one reason we have a lot of ferns down here. Okay, so here's what the fern's life cycle looks like. So the fern here, the big structure that you are probably familiar with when you hear the word fern is actually the sporophyte, is 2N. So in ferns, the gametophyte is small, and the sporophyte is large. That's probably better. Okay, so the big fern is a sporophyte. Inside, if you've ever seen a fern, the little dots that are on the back of the fern, as it develops, those dots will have meiosis occur inside of them. They'll create haploid spores. Those spores will be released, and they're going to form a tiny little gametophyte. And the gametophyte is a little teeny leaf-like structure. And the gametophyte is pretty interesting how it does it. It's got one side of it which is going to be have sperm produced, and the other side is going to have the eggs. It's going to have a region where there is the egg and a region where there is sperm. So it's called the antheridium and the archegonium. Don't worry about those terms. In order for sperm to reach the egg, so sperm from one side of the gametophyte to reach egg from the other side of the gametophyte, it has to swim, and it has to swim through water. So there needs to be enough water present for sperm to be able to swim around that gametophyte and go to the other side to fertilize the egg. Otherwise, fertilization can't occur. So once fertilization occurs, you now have a 2N zygote, so a diploid zygote, and it'll grow into a new leafy fern. So the large part of this is a sporophyte. The gametophyte is very small. And the sporophyte will actually grow out of the gametophyte. It'll grow out of that little leaf that's on the base there. So the fertilization stage there on the right, that requires water to be present. So ferns can never be very far away from water. They have to be in a moist environment, they have to be in a swampy environment. They need to be somewhere where there's at least water during part of the year so that fertilization can occur. So the fern itself can survive pretty well without water. It's reproduction that requires water. Okay, so here is a picture of ferns again. So here's ferns, and you can see this is the mature sporophyte, and the little dots on the underside of the fern are spores. So that's where meiosis occurs. It will release those spores, and you can see up in the top right corner, the gametophyte is at the base there, and you can see the new sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. So the gametophyte will be in an aquatic or a wet environment, and the sperm will swim from one end of the gametophyte to the other end, fertilizing the egg, and then the sporophyte's going to grow out of it. These, what are called fiddleheads, are young sporophytes that are starting to unfurl. Fiddleheads are very tasty as well. You can grill them up. There's lots of good nutrients in them. Okay. All right, so that's a fern. So we had mosses with a large gametophyte and a small sporophyte, and this has changed in the ferns. Ferns have a small gametophyte and a large sporophyte. And we're actually going to see, as we go to gymnosperms and to angiosperms, the sporophyte generation is going to get larger, and the gametophyte generation is going to get smaller. So right now, the sporophyte is larger, but the gametophyte's still a pretty good size to it. But we're going to get even more drastically different. Okay, so for a very long time, ferns and mosses were really the only land plants found on Earth. So that was from ferns came about 360 million years ago. It wasn't until about 140 million years ago that we actually had flowers. Okay, so vascular tissue was 425 million years. And I guess seeds came about 360. So we had early gymnosperms about 360 million years ago. But ferns and mosses were alone for a fair amount of time. It was the end of what's called the Carboniferous period, and I don't want you to concern yourself with those periods. But at a certain point in time, the Earth started to dry out. Climate of the Earth became drier and colder, which started to favor the evolution of gymnosperms and then ultimately angiosperms. So the reason why ferns and mosses weren't enough, they weren't successful in the majority of the Earth, is that there was a lot drier weather and harsher winters, so an organism needed to be able to complete their life cycle completely on dry land. So there were regions of the Earth without water year-round, or without lots of water year-round. So the strategies of the fern and the moss that needed water to reproduce were not successful in those parts of the world. There also was need to be able to withstand long, harsh winters. So descendants of early gymnosperms include conifers, cone-bearing plants, so pine trees. These are all what are called gymnosperms, and we're going to talk about what they look like. Okay, so here's the gymnosperms on this tree, and we're going to see the first seeds. Okay, so gymnosperm had even further reduction of the gametophyte. So the gametophyte was already the smaller of the two generations in the ferns. In the gymnosperm, the gametophyte is even further reduced, and we're going to see that it is a very small structure on the pine tree. The pine tree majority of it is a sporophyte. We also see something called pollen, and you've probably heard of pollen. If you have allergies, that's what a lot of people are allergic to. Pollen is a way of getting sperm from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte without water. So sperm or pollen will protect the sperm and make it so it no longer requires water. It doesn't have to swim. It has another mode of getting from one place to another. And also we're going to see seeds, and seeds protect the embryo, keep the embryo from drying out. So again, you don't need to have an aquatic environment for the embryo to first develop in. And it will also allow you to delay germination. So you can have pollination and fertilization occur at one point, and then you can wait until conditions are right to have the seed germinate. And if any of you have planted any seeds, you've exploited this. You've taken a seed that was developed at one time, that was fertilized at one time, kept in a dry environment, and then you put it in the soil, you give it some water, you give it ideal conditions, and it's going to germinate and produce a plant somewhere else. So with mosses and ferns, as soon as there's fertilization, it starts to grow. It has to grow at that point, and so it has to be in an ideal environment all the time so that it can, or at least during the points of reproduction, so it can grow. A gymnosperm has the option of producing a seed, and then the seed can wait until conditions are right for germination. So this allows it to survive things like the winter. It can wait until spring and then germinate. So reproduction could happen prior to the winter, maybe in the fall, and then germination can happen in the spring. And this allows for plant life cycles to really exist in environments where there is a harsh winter or a harsh summer. So some plants down here do the opposite. They go dormant during the summer, and then they'll come out again in the winter. Okay, so just to look at these three groups and look in terms of the sporophyte versus gametophyte, mosses, we have the gametophyte be the majority of the plant, and the sporophyte is just that little reproductive stalk off the top. Ferns, we have a dominant sporophyte now and a gametophyte, but the gametophyte is separate. In gymnosperms, and we'll see this in angiosperms as well, the gametophyte actually grows within the sporophyte. So we have the sporophyte is a majority of the plant, and we'll see within those flowers, within the pollen-bearing fruit or pollen-bearing cones of a gymnosperm is where you have your gametophytes. The gametophyte is actually just a small piece of tissue within the sporophyte. Okay. All right, so in gymnosperms, and we'll see this in angiosperms as well, the gametophyte lives on the dominant sporophyte. So meiosis occurs within male and female cones on the sporophyte, producing pollen and eggs. And pollen and eggs are the gametophyte, really. So just like humans, we have a very reduced gametophyte to the point where the gametophyte in us is just one single cell. In the gymnosperms and angiosperms, it's pretty much that. So pollen and eggs, the egg cells can be several cells, but it's never a lot of cells. It's not as multicellular as something like a fern or a moss, and definitely not like the algae that we saw before. So the gametophyte is very small, and the gametophyte is protected by the sporophyte tissue. So we're going to show you the cross-section of one of these cones, but the gametophyte is found within the sporophyte tissue. So on pines, like this ponderosa pine, you have cones that produce eggs, so ovule-producing cones, and you also have pollen-producing cones. And some trees have strategies where there'll be a tree that only produces pollen, or there'll be a tree that only produces eggs, and then sometimes there'll be trees that produce a mixture of the two. There's different strategies for different species. That's not something we're going to get into, but that does exist. This is something you have to be conscious of in flowering plants, which we'll talk about, that you can have a male and a female plant, and if you want to have fruit, you need one of each, right? So, okay. So if we look a little bit closer at what's going on inside of these cones, here's what it looks like. Here's a cross-section of a female cone, and definitely don't worry about any of these terms, but inside of the integument, which is the outer coating within the female cone, is where the haploid gametophyte is, and you've got a few cells there to make up the egg, and you can see that it develops into the female gametophyte is the ovule there. Eventually, pollen grain will meet up with this female cone, and it will fertilize the egg, and you'll get development, early development of the embryo inside of the still inside of the female cone to produce a seed, and then the seeds will be dropped and they can go dormant until conditions are right for them to germinate. So everything happens inside of the parent sporophyte. So the gametophyte is never free living. It's never living on its own like it is in the ferns. And it can be protected from desiccation, protected from predation, things like that by the sporophyte. So besides a reduced gametophyte, the other big adaptation and kind of the big name adaptation that the gymnosperms have is the presence of seeds. So seeds package the plant embryo, and it packages the plant embryo along with a food supply. So they'll also grow cells that can act as a food source for the developing embryo, and they're covered in a protective coating that keeps them from drying out. So seeds can then remain dormant for days, months, or years, depending on the species, waiting until favorable conditions occur for them to germinate. So there are species down here, and in a lot of forests there are species of pine tree where they actually have to, certain pine species actually have to be exposed to fire in order to germinate, in order for the seeds to be released. So what this does is it allows the parent to reproduce, to have these seeds that it's produced, but wait until conditions occur where there's going to be lots of resources available for their offspring to grow. So if they wait until fire clears the forest, there's now a lot less competition for their offspring, and their offspring can germinate after that fire. And so the seed will protect the offspring so they survive the fire, and that fire will trigger germination so that the offspring will germinate right after the fire event. So a lot of environments where they have periodic fires, so every few years there's a fire that runs through, this is a way of ensuring that after the fire, their offspring will start to grow. And their offspring will usually grow pretty well because there's going to be reduced competition because the fire killed off most of the other species there. So in a lot of environments, fires are great things. This is something down here. Periodically, there are fires that will clear out a lot of the vegetation and allow for next generations of vegetation to grow. And it's a very important thing. And so you may hear of controlled burns going on around here. A lot of the wildlife groups will actually do controlled burns to maintain this regimen and allow for the next offspring to germinate. Otherwise, you get overgrowth and you'll get fires that are out of control, so they try to keep them down. This is something that they attempt to do out west. And one of the reasons why we have so many wildfires in Colorado and in California and those environments is because they don't do controlled burns. So environments that normally would burn every few years and regrow are now not burning until they have so much fuel buildup that they just burn out of control. So seeds will protect plant embryos, allowing them to survive until conditions are favorable for them to start growing. So it was a huge advantage for land plants to have seeds. Okay so far? All right. All right. Okay. So the last group are the angiosperms. And these are ones that you've probably heard more about because they are pretty. They dominate modern landscape. They're represented by about 250,000 species. And most of our food and much of our fiber for even textiles, things like that. So a lot of the fiber for cloth, so cotton, and some of the other fibers that we use to make different things out of are from angiosperms. Angiosperms have been very successful on land, partially because they have a very refined vascular system that makes water transport extremely efficient. They also have flowers. So angiosperms are called flowering plants, and we're going to look at flowers. And I'm going to show you a little video, actually, of a pretty cool way that a flower gets pollinated. So in the gymnosperms, the way that pollen, so the sperm, gets to the egg is typically by wind. So a lot of them are wind pollinators. Wind will blow and pollen will be released and it will go everywhere and hopefully some of it lands where it's supposed to. So it's kind of broadcasting their pollen out. And this is why a lot of people with allergies, they're allergic to gymnosperm pollen because gymnosperms will release their pollen by wind and it goes everywhere. It gets all over your cars, everything like that, right? So if they're getting pollen in your airway, if they're getting pollen on your car, if they're getting pollen on your street, all of that pollen is not going to the egg. And so there's a lot of waste in the gymnosperms. So angiosperms have a mechanism of reproduction that's enhanced with flowers. So flowers will allow them to direct pollination by using a pollinator like a wasp or a bee, or a bat or a hummingbird. So there's all kinds of different vectors, different mechanisms for getting pollen from one place to another. And what they're doing is trying to control their pollination. So a lot of insects will specialize for certain types of flowering plants, and they'll fly from one flower to the next, and as they do, they're picking up pollen from one flower, they're bringing it over to another and dropping it off. And so the pollen is not broadcast, it's now stuck on that bee as that bee goes from one flower to the next, and it gets dropped off. So flowers are a huge advantage for minimizing the waste in reproduction. They also have, angiosperms also have this way of protecting their seed and ensuring dispersal of their seed called a fruit. So the flowers, as they develop, they make a seed, and then they surround the seed into a protective dispersal mechanism called a fruit. So the real reason why flowering plants have fruit is to allow for dispersal. So berries and apples and other kinds of fruits that you might encounter entice organisms like us or birds or bats or any other fruit-eating animal to pick that fruit and take it somewhere else. And a lot of fruits, their seeds are tough enough that they can actually survive passing through the digestive tract of an animal. So you think like a bear. Bears eat tons and tons of berries. So wild raspberries, wild blueberries, things like that. They will just gorge themselves on berries, and they walk around and then they poop. And in their poop is just a pile of seeds. And it's a pile of seeds now surrounded by manure, so by poop, which is excellent nutrients for the new berry plant. So it's just going to grow right there. So they've dispersed it, and they've also cleaned off the outside layer of the fruit, and they've deposited it in fertilizer, right? So genius thing for these plants to develop. They not only don't have to worry about dispersal, they don't have to fertilize their offspring. Their offspring, that gets done for them by things like bears or birds or things like that. There's even some, like down here, there's a lot of orchids and other plants that grow up in the canopy of trees. So bryophytes, things like that, that'll grow on the sides of the trees. And they actually have to be, their fruits will be picked up by birds, and they'll be carried over, and the birds will drop them on the top of a neighboring tree, and that's how they end up there. So they require that bird to bring them around. It would be really hard for those plants to disperse without having something like that around. So very cool way of this happening. So the flower is very, very important for both those reasons, but the first reason, it provides an enticement for a pollinator, and that's what its real design is for. It's a reproductive structure that serves to aid reproduction by attracting insects or other animals, because there'll be birds, there'll also be bats that pollinate things, to transfer pollen. So it has in it both a female part, right here, the ovule and the stigma and the style, so the carpel right there. I'm not going to expect you to know the names of these parts. If you take a botany class, you definitely get into this more, but we have covered enough material now. But so it has a female part there, the stigma, style, and ovary. It also has a male part, the stamen, the anther, and the filaments. And oftentimes, near the base of the ovule here, near the base of the female part, there would be nectar. There'll be some kind of reward. And that's what entices the insect or the bird or the bat to come in and to interact with the flower. They have some sort of reward mechanism. As the insect comes in, it'll be covered in pollen from the stamen, and then as it flies onto another flower, it'll deposit that pollen on the stigma. As it enters the flower, the first thing it hits is the stigma, and it will deposit some of that, that pollen as it goes. Okay. So flowers are reproductive structures that will aid reproduction by attracting a pollinator of some sort. So flowers can take on many different shapes and many different colors because they're mainly adapted for one particular kind of pollinator. So all the different beautiful shapes and colors and sizes of flowers are all because there's different pollinators with different desires, different kinds of mechanism. So there's this really cool old video, which I haven't been able to find. If so, I would show you clips from it, called Sexual Encounters of the Floral Kind. If you ever come across this at some point, you should check it out. And it's all about plant sex. It's all about flowering plant sex, and all about all the different strategies that flowers have for enticing pollinators. So there's simple things like just having a certain kind of nectar, having a certain shape, having a certain color, all the way up through more complex mechanisms. And I'm going to show you one of these mechanisms, if I can get this next clip to work. But first I'm going to talk about it. So there are certain types of orchids. Orchids are pretty beautiful plants, but there's some orchids that actually grow in the shape of a female wasp. So the orchid itself, its coloration, it has these little hair-like structures around it, which looks like the hairs that are on a female wasp, and just its overall shape and size really look pretty much like a female wasp. And what happens is male wasps will actually attempt to mate with the flower. And as they're doing that, they're getting pollen stuck on them. And then they'll go over to the next flower. When they get frustrated, they'll go over to the next flower and try to mate with it. And they'll transfer the pollen in that way. So this is, I think, a pretty unique way, but this is one of many different strategies that plants have. There's some plants that'll actually trap the insect, and they have a secret trap door that the insect will have to go out through, and as they go out, they have pollen stuck on their back. And then when they fly to another one, they'll get trapped in it, and as they go through, they'll deposit the pollen. And there's very elaborate ways that these flowers have developed which ensure their pollination. And this is just one, and I find this one pretty interesting. So I'm going to show you a clip of this. See if I can pull this up. Okay. So let's just... Well, all right. Maybe this won't work. But regardless, you kind of get the idea. It's so the wasp thinks that the flower is a female. It tries to mate with it, gets pollen stuck on its head, and then it shows it going to other flowers, trying to mate with them, getting pollen stuck on it. And it's so attractive, it's so lifelike to the wasp, and so smells like a female wasp that there'll actually be piles of male wasps on the one flower. So kind of a crazy thing that happens. So, all right. So flowers have pretty unique reproductive mechanisms for enticing pollinators to come to them and to transfer their pollen. And this allows for very controlled movement of their reproductive tissue. Okay, so I will put a link for this video so you can watch it when you do have a good internet connection. So angiosperms, their life cycle, they spend the most time as a sporophyte. Their sporophyte grows up and has a flower on it. Within the flower is the only tissue that is haploid. It's going to be the ovule or the sperm which is in the pollen. The pollen will be moved by a pollinator from the stamen to the stigma, and then the zygote will form within the base of the flower, and a fruit will actually develop on the outside of the seed there, of the growing embryo, and the fruit is protective. It keeps the seed from desiccating. It also acts as a transport mechanism, allows the seed to be taken away from the parent as whatever that is eating the fruit takes it away. So angiosperms have really intricate relationships with animals, with heterotrophic organisms, and they entice them to pollinate them. They also entice them with fruit to disperse their seeds. So really, the only way that they would have developed this way is having evolved in the same environment as these animals, as these insects, as these mammals, as these other organisms that were going to do the dispersal. So That's why they are found so many places, and they are the majority of land plants that you interact with are flowering plants. They've been very successful due to these strategies. So just to kind of finish this up, fruit is a ripened ovary of a flower, and it aids in protection and dispersal of seeds. So it can be, there is wind dispersal, so things like cotton will have these fibery bits that come off the seed that allow it to disperse, and that's what we'll harvest and make into spin into cotton. There are animal transportation where it will actually, like burdocks that will just stick to the outside of an animal, and as the animal walks around, it'll eventually fall off and disperse that way. There are fruits that entice the animal to eat them, and they will be digested. So some will have seeds that can survive digestion. Others will count on the animal eating some of the fruit, but not all of it. So up north, it doesn't happen nearly as much down here because there's not a harsh winter, but up north, what squirrels will do is they will take fruits and seeds and they will bury them. They'll cache them so that in the winter they'll have these supplies. Squirrels, though, will bury much more than they'll ever eat, and sometimes they'll even forget where they buried them. And actually what they're doing is they're planting those seeds. So they're taking those fruits or those seeds and they're dispersing them all over the place, and they're planting them shallowly in the soil. And the ones that don't get eaten during the winter, during the spring, they'll start germinating and producing. So they're actually doing a fantastic job of farming those plants. And most of the things that we like to eat are fruits as well. The fruit tissues are enticing organisms like us to spread them out, and you might do that as well. If you eat an apple and then you throw the core away into the woods, you are dispersing apple seeds. Probably not a very good thing to do down here because apples don't grow natively out there, but that is what the apple was designed for, is for an animal to eat part of it and let the seeds germinate out in the wild. Okay. Well, all right, I think that's enough. So that's an introduction to the plants. So we had, again, 4 groups: mosses, ferns, and then gymnosperms and angiosperms. And hopefully you know a little bit about each one, some development that they've had to help them on land. And that's really just an introduction to land plants. On Tuesday, we'll talk about fungi. So that's the last group that we'll talk about before the next test, and we'll save the animal chapter for after your next test. Okay?